total global man-made greenhouse emission come from the global food system. So that's huge. And it doesn't take on board all the environmental impact of agriculture and livestock production when it comes to loss of biodiversity. So a huge impact, a huge impact. This webinar is about making food systems more sustainable and less environmentally damaging. And it comes at a very good point, and it's very relevant. First, because this year, in 2021, it's the super year. I mean, we just had the UNFCCC, we had the biodiversity COP, and then we have the COP26. So this is the year where we have to take decision, and we have to think before taking decision. We will focus here on Africa, because it's there that many of these challenges are going to find solution or to get derailed. So that's really the focus we're going to have. And of course, the Memo panel is the right place to think it about. Not only because in this panel, in this 16 people panel, we have a lot of energy, of intelligence, and behind institution working, engaged, committed to have this impact and to really contribute to progress and solution, but also because there have been a lot of work in the Memo panel on this issue, and especially report. So I'm very glad, I'm very happy and honored to introduce the three speakers we have ahead. So I will take them in the order they will speak. So I will start with Nachilala. So Nachilala Kombo, you will set the scene for the African continent. So I will say some words about your career. You're a Memo panel member. You hold a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Zambia, but also a master's degree in public policy and management from the University of Potsdam in Germany. You've been joining the WWF in 2018, and I recall you're now country director for the WWF in Zambia. You've been working in lots of progress, and especially progress including the restoration of depleted wildlife species, restoration of degraded forest, empowerment of communities and sustainability. And all this is really key to what we're going to talk about. You are a leading voice on innovation, on sustainability and sustainable agriculture in Zambia, and more globally in Africa. You have a very long experience in management across various organizations, and you're going to talk about it. And your leadership expertise covers a range of sustainability development policies areas, with the most recent one, where you successfully led partnerships in the African Union and the African Development Bank, and also with civil society and governments of various African countries. So you're really very qualified to help us understand what is going on. Our second speaker is Suzanne Chomba. She's the director of Vital Landscape for Africa at the World Resource Institute, WRI, we all know about. She leads the WRI works on forest, food system and people, which includes forest landscape restoration, sustainable agricultural food system. And she contributes with her work in this vital landscape field to 5 global goals: climate change, mitigation and adaptation, poverty reduction and gender equality, reversal of biodiversity loss, and building resilience in agriculture, and also enhancing access to clean energy. So she's a scientist. She's been working especially with the C4 ICRAF, and she's really been instrumental in setting the agenda for landscape restoration through local, national, and global platform. She holds a PhD in forest governance from the University of Copenhagen, and also a very double and master in agricultural development. So really a very qualified person. Then we will hand it over to Ismail Sunga, a MAMO panel member. So he is the Chief Executive Officer of the Southern African Confederation of Agricultural Unions. He holds a bachelor degree in economics from the University of Zimbabwe, and also graduated from the University of Derby in UK. His experience spans several sectors and areas, including small enterprise development, agriculture, rural development, and really since his appointment in his current position, he successfully grew its membership from 6 member organizations in 4 countries to 18 members in 13 countries. He established strategic partnership and alliance with the development of public and private sectors. So really, he is the instrumental person, and he had the energy to convey all efforts so that we can have a strong cooperation. So he's been working with so many organizations. I will take at least 10 more minutes to develop all the work he has done. So I will just stop it so that we give time to speakers. So with these wonderful speakers we have the chance to have around the table, I will start with perhaps with Nachilala. Nachilala, could you set the scene on the African continent? What do Africa food system look like today?
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for the kind introduction, and also in actually helping me set the scene. And good afternoon, everyone. In terms of how the African food system looks like, as any food system around the world, it's actually a complex system that includes a range of activities, obviously that start with activities that happen at the production level, whether it's crop-related production and we produce a range, whether it's animal and livestock-related production, whether it's fishing, whether it's forestry. So there's a range of activities that characterize the African food system. So the production side is not the only part, because they are related subsectors that come together to make the African food system. These include, but not limited to, the water resources management sector. As you know, water is a very, very important resource around food production. The education sector, because it provides the skill, the finance and technology sector, to mention but a few. I also just wanted to mention that we are talking about the African food system today within the context of 3 major challenges or shifts. The first one being around the reality that we have basically a ballooning African population, meaning the way in which we are producing food now needs to change for us to be not only more efficient, but more sustainable. We are facing, as an African continent, unprecedented levels of environmental degradation or ecosystem degradation. As you know, ecosystems do provide us a range of biodiversity services that do support food production and also provide us the capabilities to withstand shocks such as climate. The third big trend or challenge that the food systems in Africa do face is the climate challenge itself. Much as most of the greenhouse emissions have not been contributed by Africa, we are facing the impacts, but at the same time, we are also contributing. The point I'm trying to make is that the way agriculture is happening on the continent of Africa does not put us off the hook. Just to give you an illustration, the southern part of Zambia, where I come from, has been the food basket of the country for so many years. And because of unsustainable agriculture production methods, heavy deforestation, the rainfall pattern there has shifted. So more often than not, that region does not have the sufficient rains. It may have the expertise to produce, it doesn't have the sufficient rain to produce. So in the context of a rapidly growing population, the degradation of the environment and climate change, the whole subject of food systems transformation in Africa is an imperative one. Now, coming down to the core issue of large-scale ecosystem degradation caused by agriculture, in just 2 decades, from 1940 to 1960, the agriculture area for crops and grazing in Africa grew by 40%. As all of you may already know, agriculture in Africa is responsible for 80% of the deforestation that we see and a significant amount of contribution to greenhouse gases. If we go to the region of West Africa, between 1975 and 2013, cropland doubled in West Africa. And again, because the concept around increasing food production has largely relied on expanding land and not really looking at how can we use the land that's already been converted more efficiently. And so that has had the doubling impact in terms of undermining the very ecosystems that are needed for food production. East Africa, the situation is similar. Between 1966 and 2018, wetland areas fell by 55%. And again, largely driven by unsustainable agriculture activities that have been done in the name of development. So these farming practices, agriculture practices, have resulted in massive fragmentation and degradation of ecosystem, and also massive loss of biodiversity. And the point here is that a degraded ecosystem or degraded soils are no good for food production. And therefore, if we've been on a path that is contributing to degradation or reducing our capacity to produce food, then we need to think differently in terms of how food production should go forward in Africa post the food summit. It is estimated that overexploitation and degradation of African ecosystem will result in the loss of half of Africa's bird and mammal species and a number of organisms, 20 to 30% of lake productivity by the end of the century, as well as a decline in wildlife and fisheries. Some people may not see fisheries and wildlife as part of the equation, but our wildlife resources and our fisheries resources, when properly managed, are part of the food systems proposition and also a part of the larger economic development proposition for the continent of Africa. So when we're talking about the decline of species, most directly is crucial, because if we kill the organisms in the soil, like keep the soils healthy and fertile, then we are likely to experience crop failure. If we kill the habitat that keeps the pollinators, we'll be planting the seed, but the organisms will not be there. The birds and the insects will not be there to complete the whole process that is required for food production. Another common characteristic of our food system in Africa is that we're largely rain-fed. Because we are rain-fed, variable rainfall patterns, a large occurrence of droughts, as well as floods mean a disaster. It means that African countries, African governments, African communities lose control in terms of their own management of food systems. And again, here, this is where we speak to the whole need for for us to actively participate in reversing or stopping climate change, but at the same time, actively look at ways in which we can, at scale, implement more sustainable methods of agriculture that include, but not limited to, what we refer to as conservation agriculture practices for us, one, to be able to build the resilience that the agriculture communities do need and that agriculture systems do need, but also to really make sure that we don't continue to contribute to emission of greenhouse gases. Despite the changed context for the African agriculture food system, only a few countries have actually transformed the agriculture support program. 65% of our land in Africa is classified as degraded. It means it cannot be as productive. So if 65% of the land is unproductive and the population is growing and we don't change our methods of managing our food systems, then we're planning for a disaster in the future. Despite the success that we have seen through climate smart, sustainable, and conservation and regenerative agriculture approaches in different African countries, the main policies of Africa still rely heavily on the use of organic fertilizer that actually plays a very big role in terms of degrading the soils and also contributing to greenhouse emissions. Most of the food production is led by smallholder farmers with very limited technological and mechanization support. And so in terms of really looking at ways in which efficiencies can be gained, added value can be gained, there is a limitation, especially down the value chain or down the supply chain. And so when you look at, for example, the aspect of food loss, a lot of food is produced in Africa. A significant chunk of that food is actually lost because of weak infrastructure to manage the quality of food once it's actually produced. It is therefore important to address both the methods of agriculture production that are dominant, such as the extensification of land and uncontrolled conversion of land, which is also required for other uses, such as, but not limited to, habitat for other forms of biodiversity, for wildlife, and other social, economic, and cultural activity. That balance in land use has been key over the years in terms of contributing to the stability of the climate. So inefficient use of water, when you look at how water is utilized, there's quite a lot of wastage. When you look at how soils are maintained, there's just not enough support, including from the government extension services, in terms of how farming communities can better take care of their soils. There is hope because there's pockets of success, again, around how climate smart agriculture, conservation agriculture, is creating the shift and also supporting some of the regeneration that is needed. With the changing climate, the policy interventions will need to address and make projections of what the scenario will look like if we maintain where we are in the next 10, 20, 50, and 100 years. We need to make the policy innovations now that will facilitate and deliver sufficient and nutritious food that is safe to everyone on the continent, and including planning for the unborn generation. So from the point of view of WWF, our position is really that we really need to make sure that we give a voice to those who are practicing regenerative or sustainable agriculture. We look at very integrated modes of land use management and planning that actually optimizes the health of ecosystems and the health of people. For hundreds of years, Africans have been able to access food, not only the grown food, but healthy and even superfoods from the forest. So there's always a trade-off that is there in terms of food quality when all the forests are eliminated to plant the same monolithic maize and stuff like that. So it's for us, it's very key that we develop a culture as well that stresses the importance of taking care of important watersheds and water bodies. We have too frequent a phenomena, at least in my country, Zambia, where we have drying rivers and watersheds. What that means is that the capacity and the room for agriculture to thrive is actually limited. We also have been looking at how do we promote and encourage more sustainable consumption, particularly looking at the linkages between cities and rural areas. How can consumption patterns in cities encourage production in farms that is diverse and that is actually sustainable? Some of the old practices or institutional mechanisms, such as extension services, we think that these are still remain very important. However, they need to be updated. They need to be in line with the times, and they need to build stronger sensitivity to the natural environment and promoting the methods at scale that will limit the degradation of the natural environment, or even actually that will promote greater regeneration and restoration. Dependence on rainwater calls on the need for us to maybe look at other forms in which we can actually store water when we have excess water. So investment in rain storage mechanism is very important. Protection of groundwater sources and aquifers is very important. And again, because of uncoordinated land uses, you find that in some countries, at least in my country, you have developments in sensitive water areas or in aquifers that should not be there. And the result of that is that the groundwater system is interrupted, and the sustainability of water supply is also actually interrupted. While these interventions would limit the expansion into new agriculture areas that are fragile, would contribute to the conservation of ecosystems, rangelands and wetlands and mangrove, there are a number of positive outcomes that can be generated from deliberate climate mitigation methods that we've learned over time. At the same time, there's a universal access that is needed, or investment in early warning system, including insurance system. How does a food system of the future move to a stage where the smallholder farmer can have access to weather index insurance? How do we make sure that that community that's living side by side with wildlife can get insurance for being vulnerable to human and wildlife conflict? Because we believe that when we secure biodiversity, we're not only securing food production, we're securing economic, social, and political stability for the future. When you look at the demand side measures, in particular to reduce the problem of food loss on food waste that I talked about, it needs a whole of society approach to address. We need investments in support sectors I mentioned earlier: logistics, food infrastructure, processing, refrigeration, and the big one, electricity. There's too many Africans that don't have access to electricity, and there's no way players in the ag system, farmers, are going to participate effectively in transforming the food system, in protecting and restoring the ecosystem, if they don't have a range of options for them to conserve and store their food after it's actually produced. So there's complexity in the African food system. As I started from the beginning, it requires a lot of coordination between different sectors, between different actors. It needs leadership. It needs grassroots leadership, because at the grassroots level, there's a lot of knowledge in terms of what works. What needs to happen then is for the government to create institutions and policies that enable that which the grassroots or the people on the front line have determined works, that builds that resilience they require around climate, that helps them and incentivizes them to adopt more sustainable and more regenerative approaches to ecosystems utilization, but also to land and water resources management. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nachilala. So that's really very important in-depth analysis you gave to us, and a very relevant proposal we are going to discuss during the Q&A sessions. So I hand it over to Suzanne, who is here. I saw her previously. So Suzanne, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me, and can you see me?
Yeah, that's perfect. So Susan, what is the business case for sustainable food system Nachilala has presented? She presented a long list of things we have to do, but how can we do this? Who are the key players, and who will pay for it, and how to mobilize the necessary funds? So can you give us some insight?
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. In case I break, just interrupt me so that I can switch off my video. But for the time being, let me start with my video on. First of all, thank you so much for the invitation to join this panel and really discuss the issue around food systems in Africa. So in terms of the business case for sustainable food systems, I would say that for food systems to be sustainable economically, that is to make a business case, they also must be sustainable environmentally and socially today and in the future. So it's not just about increasing food productivity, because we know very well that the Green Revolution model that the world has relied on since 1940s, 1950s, has been extremely successful in many parts of the world in terms of increasing agricultural productivity, to the extent that it has even outstripped in terms of population. So you see that, that model has led to increased agricultural productivity, even in areas where population has been growing. But that model hasn't worked for Africa. And that's what Nchilala has been just mentioning, the failures for the model in Africa. So the business case for this continent has to go beyond, as we have to think beyond increasing food productivity, increasing, to look at whether that food productivity is then resulting into incomes, whether it's resulting into positive environmental outcomes. So currently, I'll focus on a few things. Currently on agricultural subsidies. And I know this is a very complex area to navigate, right? Because for the African continent, the subsidies haven't been as intense and as great as we've seen in other places. But the question is, do we want to use the same model of increasing subsidies, and especially subsidies that are resulting in externalities? And then after we get to a certain point, we realize we made a mistake and we want to go back to square one. So for instance, the very successful Malawi subsidy model that is very clearly elaborated in the Malmo report. My question is, this model has been extremely successful in Malawi in ensuring that food is doubled, tripled, and that it has translated the country from a net importer of food, net hunger, to a net exporter of food, which is a great outcome in itself. But then the report also highlights that this has not necessarily translated to better household outcomes in terms of wealth. And also, we have not seen whether we have done any evaluations in terms of the outcomes on the soils, on the biodiversity, on the rivers, water systems, and other kind of environmental outcomes. So a successful business case for food systems need to go beyond, again, food production. It needs to ensure that we are generating wealth, and that wealth at the household level needs to be equitably shared. So it's not just wealth that is skewed towards one gender or one age group or one part of the country. It's wealth that needs to be equitably distributed. So it does involve unraveling the costs of depleting natural capital in each and every part of the world. So we know very well, as the first speaker mentioned, that most of our agricultural productivity on the continent comes from area expansion. So we are expanding into natural ecosystems in order to continue increasing our agricultural productivity. And so business models that are looking at how we can intensify production in a sustainable manner are going to be extremely critical. Now, the business case involves unraveling those costs that I mentioned, but also just to point out that for the International Labour Organization, it estimates that 1.2 billion jobs rely on effective management and sustainable management of ecosystems, including the food sector. So there's no case, we can't say that, oh, but if we focus on too much on sustainable land management, then we might end up with job losses, or food systems that are transitioning towards sustainability may end up in job losses. The evidence is on the contrary. And actually, research continues to demonstrate the potential returns on investment on sustainable land management practices in various scenarios and contexts. I'll give you a very good example. In restoration, for every dollar that is invested in restoring land to productivity, you get at least $7 in return, at least. In some cases, this is on the lower side. In some cases, you can get more. So there's every reason when you look at return on investment on sustainable land management practices that can be able to drive business and catalyze business scenarios for this kind of management, food production in the food sector. So the benefits of investing in sustainable food production far much outweigh the costs of environmental pollution, soil health, water pollution, biodiversity, human health, and climate. And just to emphasize that right now we are seeing more and more reports and businesses are realizing other risks that are part of not investing in sustainable land management practices. So risks within the demand side and risk within the supply side, okay? So on the demand side, we've just heard that agriculture is very, very sensitive to climate change, right? Climate impacts. So if we have a model, a business model that is not recognizing that sensitivity, then what we end up is continued extraction, and businesses will not be sustainable in the long term. So we've seen actually recently, and I think even during and after the Food System Summit, big companies, and big food sector businesses announcing that they are going to invest billions of dollars on regenerative agriculture, agroecological practices. And so this is the connection that they are making, that eventually our supply chains, smallholder farmers, if we don't invest in them, if we don't invest in sustainable land management, in sustainable food production, and climate change impacts, drought and flooding continue to be felt and exacerbate at the rate that we are seeing, then the supply of raw materials, the maize, the sweet potatoes, whatever they are using in their business models is going to be at risk. So that's one thing that we are seeing very, very critical. Secondly, on the demand side, we've seen very strong social movements that are really, really driving the agenda for sustainable food production. So any business case, any businessman or woman who is in the food sector and does not realize that kind of push, social movements push, then they do risk their demand chains. Because who's going to buy from your business if you're not taking care of, if you're not looking at sustainable food production? So I would say that the vulnerability of the supply chains in a rapidly changing climate, as well as consumer and social movements, are really driving business case towards sustainability. And so you might ask, well, if the case is so strong, why are we not seeing rapid changes? Why are we not seeing everybody, rapid take up of sustainable land management practices? I've said investment, we are seeing pronunciations, and we have to be careful that that does not become an avenue of greenwashing in the food sector, right? Because yes, what we mean by regenerative agriculture, what we mean by agroecological practices, we do need, as a research community, as other stakeholders, we do need those kind of guardrails so that businesses do know what are the matrices, what are the parameters for that kind of sustainability. But the demand and the excitement is there. Now, who will pay for it? We will all pay for it. We can't say so and so, or private sector or public sector or the consumer will pay for it. We are all going to pay for it. And I'm going to demonstrate how we are going to pay for it, all of us. On the consumer side, there's sufficient evidence of consumer willingness to pay for healthier, nutritious, and sustainable food, as long as the purchasing power is there, okay? So we've seen that in developed countries, in places where purchasing power of consumers is high, that they tend to shift towards more healthier, sustainable foods, yeah, and nutritious foods. So then what we need to do is to understand that the true cost of accounting for food shows that such food, safe, healthy and nutritious food, does not need to be expensive. Right now we have this dichotomy where safe and nutritious food tends to be very, very expensive. But why is it being expensive? Because we are not applying the full accounting for food. We are not doing the full costing for food. So you end up with food that is healthy and well-produced becoming too expensive, whereas the industrial model that is producing mass food that is not necessarily very safe and that is highly subsidized becomes very cheap, and it's supposed to compete with food that is produced in a different way. So this is what we need to understand. That doesn't need to be the case. And that's where policy, government policies, and so that brings me to my second point, that the government and the public sector, that's where it comes in. So the consumer willingness to pay is there. We don't need to have that dichotomy of safe and nutritious food being extremely expensive if we apply the full accounting for food. So then the governments come in, national governments, in terms of redirecting the kind of agricultural subsidies. So the question I've given, and for Africa, I know we are starting at a different point. A lot of countries, we are so much concerned about food security. First of all, fill the bellies. Even before you talk about, nutrition, by the time somebody is thinking about how nutritious the food I consumed was, first of all, we need to ensure that people are not sleeping hungry. They can happen at the same time, but I'm just talking about reality. If you have masses of food, masses of people that are suffering from hunger, what we see is the tendency for us to produce a lot of maize or produce a lot of rice that is supposed to feed people. But we have to look at the nutritional aspect. But above that, ensure that the subsidies, the government are directing subsidies from high input, high polluting practices to holistic food production models. So farmers need to be able to realize the benefits of investing in sustainable land management practices and safe and nutritious food. So that's the role of the government, those kind of subsidies, redirecting subsidy programs, regional and economic blocks. So we currently, again, just to reemphasize the point that there's a strong emphasis on the continent on the aspect of food security and prosperity, and fair enough, because if you're dealing with hundreds or thousands of people who are still hungry, then that becomes your priority. But that prosperity does not need to come at the expense of the environment and does not need to come at the expense of people's health and welfare. So what is largely missing is to make the linkage of prosperity and food security in our regional and economic blocks and policies with health and nutrition, as well as with environmental outcomes. So there is job to do there. If you look at the Malabo Declaration, if you look at regional economic policies such as AFTA, we are not seeing those kind of strong leakages. And so there's need to emphasize that and policies that can be able to address that gap. For the private sector, I've talked a lot about the risks that that the private sector is faced with, both on demand and the supply side, and therefore investing in sustainable land management and equitable value chains and social protection is going to be critical. So the private sector, I think I've already made a case there in terms of how they will pay for it. On the producer side, I know we tend to think producers shouldn't pay. Actually, the producers are already paying. Smallholder farmers, fishers, and other communities, there's a cost of transitioning to sustainable food systems. And these costs may largely lie on the aspect of knowledge, labor. Sustainable food systems are knowledge intensive, they are labor intensive. What we are not doing is we are not paying for the cost of the smallholder farmers. And that's why we are not seeing the transition. I keep saying, my mom is a smallholder farmer. And every time we have to talk about more practices that are involving more of her time, more of her labor, she asks, who's going to pay for this? Why should I? Why should I, for instance, invest in cut and carrying, biological nitrogen fixing shrubs to put them in my farm? After I do all of that, am I going to get a better price for my produce? If the answer is no, what is the easiest thing to do? Apply whatever else there is to apply, right? So the farmers, the smallholder farmers, the producers, they already pay for it in areas that we are not, it's us who are not compensating them. We are not really providing that kind of an incentive. If there is an incentive to transition for them, they will transition. Global partners, I think it's a very, very important thing that we need to discuss about the African food systems and their interlinkage with our natural ecosystems. And for this one, I'd just like to focus, for instance, on the Congo Basin forest. Do we value the ecosystem services that are derived from the Congo Basin forest, the second largest continuous natural forest in the world, very rich in biodiversity, but also very critical for supporting agriculture in the region. If there's no proper valuation in terms of the ecosystem services, biodiversity, climate change, carbon that forest is storing, and you keep saying, oh, but smallholder farmers are extending their frontiers into the Congo forest. That's not gonna stop. That's not what is going to stop. What is going to stop is really taking the value of that forest for the global ecosystem services it is generating, for the biodiversity that it is generating, and providing that value to governments, to local communities, to farmers, to smallholder farmers, and then linking that to sustainable food production, so that a farmer thinks, by the time I'm extending into the natural forest, then I'll not be able to get the benefits that come from this forest. So I think the global community, for the ecosystem services that are being generated, we need to have costing for it and valuing for it, and ensuring that those benefits do reach downstream to the smallholder farmers. So let me pause there, but that's how I'd like to summarize who is going to pay for it and making a business case for sustainable food systems in Africa.
So thank you very much, Susan, and thank you very much for the very convincing demonstration that they can be a very profitable way to transition to sustainable agriculture. And it depends on the path you choose and also on the policy you choose. So we hand it over to Ishmael. We have a long list of things to change, and we've seen with Susan a strong business case for it. So how do we get on this right pathway? We know we are not starting from the scratch. In fact, many African countries, and this has been mentioned by Nachila and by Susan, have already addressing through policy intervention that are innovative and designed specifically for the national context. So there are many ways on many things on the making. So what is being done? How is it successful? And what can be done better? Can you help us to see through all this, Ishmael?
Thanks, Elizabeth, for the questions. Let me try to give it my best shot. It's very clear that the system is broken, and there are different ways of describing how it's broken, and we've heard from Nachila and from Susan and from yourself, Elizabeth, earlier on illustrations. But it would be remiss of me not to give another perspective that I think is very damning in terms of describing how broken it is. It is essentially delivered poverty and malnutrition to the smallholder farming community. That's what it has done. In spite of them being sung heroes for feeding the world, but alas, they are all poor, the majority of them, and they are all malnourished. So that shows how brutal the system that we have is and how it has grossly under-delivered. So that's the way that I could describe it, coming from where I come from, representing the voice of farmers, so to speak. So it's very clear that we are at a crossroads, and that such a system that impoverishes others cannot be sustainable, and it will break down. Nature, the law of nature ultimately will prevail. So it's good that we are talking about it now to try and fix it, because it was going to fix itself, which was going to be like an uncontrolled explosion. In this case now, we are controlling the explosion in some way. So those will be my sort of opening remarks. But your question really is talking about the pathways. And it's a difficult one in the sense that because dealing with a system is difficult to have a pathway, because systems are configured differently and they've got their own dynamics and they're going to their own. So there might not be a specific pathway to addressing that. But however, there could be some elements that we can draw from the work that has been done by many countries and by researchers and also by ourselves that I can draw upon to try and give some insights into as to what needs to be. I just want to latch on one fundamental area as a talking point, policy. That I believe, and we believe as farmers organizations, that policy is one of, if we may call it that, pathways that can actually cause significant changes at scale and maybe at the lowest cost. So if we engineer policy, we might actually reach out to as many people as possible, as fast as possible, and in significant ways. So I will talk about that. I'm trying to justify why policy could be a key pathway amongst other pathways that are there. And I think innovation around policy institutions and R&D itself, technological R&D, is so critical. It now has to be policy with a systems lens. If we don't introduce integrated thinking, systems thinking in policy, then we are going to be running on the same spot, maybe repeating the same mistakes that we have. It now brings policy making a very complex process, because it is trying to balance different interests and different outcomes. And policy needs to talk to multiple outcomes. It cannot be a policy that is only talking to environmental stewardship, because if it focuses on that, it will fail. So it has to be policy talking about environmental stewardship. It is also talking about social well-being. It is talking about nutrition. And it now requires smart thinking to be able to configure that. Doing it the simpler way might give some what appears to be instant gratification, but you won't be going anyway. So difficult as it is, that's where we need to go. And and there is no unique mix of policies now. It has to be customized to different situations and different areas. But I believe that policy can give you multiple outcomes if it is carefully and purposefully configured. But to do that, you need to bring in truth to the system's way of thinking, integrated way of thinking. You need to involve different multi-stakeholders. And a lot of those multi-stakeholders might not necessarily be seeing things from the same angle. But you still need to draw them in, because if it does not have buy-in from the multi-stakeholders, it is not going to work. So, and it requires a lot of negotiations to try and put it in such a way that it answers the different, often conflicting expectations, both in terms of the key actors involved, but also in terms of the tensions between some of the biological sort of underpinnings of the system. But for that to happen, you need to provide evidence that there is going to be benefits to the different multi-stakeholders that are there. Because people are not just going to change because change is good. It is going to be change that is impactful to them. So we need to configure it in such a way that that policy is rewarding to all the different players, maybe to different extents, but still significantly, like Susan was saying, it needs really to deliver on that in significant ways. Otherwise, it becomes a talk shop. But that also, to deliver a policy that is going to talk to different interest groups, some of them powerful, you need strong political leadership. If you are not prepared to bite the bullet and go and do the right thing, then it is not going to work. So we need strong political leadership to enable that kind of a systems way of thinking, integrated way of policy decision making to happen. And more important, we also need collaboration with different partners. It's not only having partners buying into it, it means also collaborating with different partners, different stakeholders across the policy divide, across the national boundaries, and also internationally, to come to bear with the system's way of thinking, which sometimes the way it's being described can also be very frightening, because it's like it's a spaghetti ball of everything, and we need to sort it out one way or the other. But I think the point of incentives, particularly when one is transitioning from a bad system which had its own logic to a better system, but better sometimes is like beauty. It's in the eye of the beholder. If you don't incentivize it, it becomes a bit difficult. So better, it also means better in the pocket, if I have to speak in the words of farmers, apart from better in terms of the environment and nutrition. There's also the issue of effective regulations to enable that. I honestly believe that, but as I said earlier on, policies really can be, to some extent, a magic wand. You could, as an example, legislate for removal of VAT and import duties for all digital infrastructure equipment to enable that information that is so needed to manage ecosystems in far-flung areas, as an example, because private sector might not be prepared to invest in that because it's not commercially viable, and yet it is nutritionally viable, and it is socially viable, and it is environmentally viable. So it's better then to engineer policy to speak to that. Where commercial interests come in, that's fine. But you can also unlock commercial interests to come to bear with different kinds of needs. But we also need to understand that a system is always, it's not stationary, it is always moving, it's consisting of moving parts and can move in many directions. So it's important to recognize that it's evolving, it's dynamic, and then the interventions must also be continuous and nimble to speak to the different opportunities and constraints that may be unfolding as it is moving, but also having a much longer term perspective, because sometimes things don't move in a straight line, but can also get a straight line form over time, as long as the target and ambition is being achieved. So broadly, that's what I could say, what policy could do to enable things to change. But if we're to borrow on some of the work that we have done as the MAMO panel, some of the reports that we have produced have shown that indeed some of these things are possible, maybe not to the fullest extent, but that we have some beginnings that we have. For instance, if you take the irrigation example in Morocco, where there's a combination of inputs that are coming from a partnership, tax rebates, as well as other concessionary fiscal and monetary arrangements. That is really seen the area that is under irrigation doubling over a decade, which is a massive change. But it is delivered also on nutrition and on other elements. But we need to do more to try and deal with those kind of examples. There's also the example of livestock in Ethiopia, where the design was such that it had multiple outcomes that were speaking to poverty alleviation, to food security, to improve nutrition and other elements. It had both the institutional arrangements, it had also both R&D technological arrangements in it to try and drive it through. Complicated as it seems, but that actually brings good things. But finally, perhaps there are a lot of other examples that our work is illustrated, but you will find them in the reports that have been mentioned. But the important thing really is to be able to think systems, to think integration, to think multi-stakeholder, to think partnership, to think long-term, and to be more nimble and dynamic as you move with the change. I'll leave it there for now and perhaps take some of the issues in the question format. Over. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ismail, for this very relevant conclusions. And for those who are not looking at the chat, I strongly advise you to look at to have a look, because there are the references of the reports Ismail has just been referring to. So you will find the relevant links on the works of the MAMO panel dealing with irrigation of all the points just mentioned by Ismail. So we are now opening the floor for questions. I've seen some questions, so I will take them in the order as they come. Of course, I have questions myself, but I think it won't be very polite to start by mine. So we had a question from Dr. Dr. Christopher Imakando from the Copperbelt University in Zambia. He's an ecologist and is research interested in the conservation, ecology, and taxonomy of small mammals. And his question, he would like to understand how habitat degradation is affecting biodiversity and pest control in agrosystem in Zambia, which is really a very, which is a strong question. So I guess Nachilala might have some insight on it, and perhaps Suzanne too. So this is the first question. Let's just check I don't have a similar question to give you. And I have another question. Oh, it's running too fast for me, sorry. For Susan, and this question, Susan, is for you, is from Solomon Mwapikita. So you have alluded nicely on how the food system can work, be sustained. In that regard, where can we put energy production in food systems, for instance, growing of biofuels at the expense of food production and clearing a huge tracts of land? And that's a very touchy issue. So we will start by these two questions. The first one on the biodiversity and pest control in Zambia. And the second one, which is a larger one, about the question of biofuels and energy production. So Anditaver, I don't know who wants to start.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I can start.
Thank you, Nachilala.
Yeah, so I think this is a very pertinent question regarding how habitat destruction or degradation is affecting biodiversity and pest control in agro-ecosystem. I think when you look at the trend we've had, perhaps with the red locust and things like that recurring from time to time, and perhaps us not having found the right formula yet in terms of what specific interventions, restoration initiatives we need to put in place for the habitat, speaks to the fact that we need somebody like Dr. Makando to do more research on that topic, to inform a bit more in terms of perhaps measures that could be taken to restore ecosystems and also help to restore the biodiversity and help better manage the pests. I think in terms of ecological approaches to pest control, and again, in Zambia, we have small scale projects that are quite successful, where there's limitation and where perhaps an NGO project or programs like ours would need the backing of an educational institution to broaden the sample of research so that we can influence policymakers. So I think that's what I would say regarding that question, particularly in Zambia, but perhaps other countries have made progress on this and may have some insights to share.
Thank you very much, Nachilala. Maybe I hand it over to Susan, who can perhaps have a comment on this issue and on the other one on biofuels.
I think I'll focus on biofuels, and maybe Ishmael can weigh in on both, or at least on the first one. So first of all, it's a very, very tricky question, as you pointed out, the moderator, because obviously biofuels do have potential to generate economic returns, right? And both for domestic as well as for export markets. They can be able to provide low-cost fuels, and so they are an economic opportunity for a lot of African countries. However, we also see on the other side the potential for them to cause adverse environmental effects, clearing of natural ecosystems, conversion of food production, food producing areas into biofuel producing zones, as well as land use conflicts where they are replacing traditional food production systems into biofuels, and where sometimes there's capture of indigenous people's lands and being converted into biofuel production. So you have to look at those, both the benefits as well as the challenges, and then look at each country context. And I think this is where you wouldn't say there's a right or a wrong. We know what the opportunities are, we know what the advantages are, we know what the challenges are. And so policies that can be able to limit the negative effects of biofuels are going to be critical. We've seen some countries in Africa developing policies around biofuels, which are specific to the kind of biofuels that are and the kind of ecosystems that they are being that they are being implemented or grown in. So I would say it has to be contextual. I don't think that there's going to be a one size fits all. I've seen different kind of policies in different places. And I think just to recognize that we will need to look at both the advantages and the disadvantages of biofuels.
Thank you very much, Susan. So Ishmael, I would add another question, which is close to the one on biofuel. It's from Sarah Lewis, and she is a research assistant at Imperial College London, and she's working with the MEMA panel. And the question is, the world is undergoing an extensive change in our energy system. What can we learn from that experience to translate into food system transformation in Africa? That's a tough question. But for people who have been looking what Africa has achieved in the past 10 years in the change of mix of its energy system, that's incredible. So surely there are things to learn about. Ishmael, can you help us?
Yeah, well, it's not easy to answer those questions, even the biofuels one, but just to echo what Susan alluded to, that it is contextual and it is a balance of many considerations. But I think an important point here is that there needs to be consciousness around what will be the different impacts on the different elements that form the system, particularly what does it mean to the environment? Because I think it's a major parameter to consider. And then bring in the valuation model about the true costs of going biofuels and to what extent, in what proportions with others. I think it has to be evidence-driven also to be able to get a sense of, but first of all, just saying that it's a systems, we need to find a way of making sure that it is not damaging to the environment. And it does not necessarily mean that if it is not damaging to the environment, it cannot also be giving benefits elsewhere. I don't think we have given innovation and thinking enough room to try and crack it. And if we bring in elements of valuation model as well as the true costs of things, it might actually show us that maybe going in the biofuels way is a no-no. And if the answer is a no-no, we need to respect that evidence and look at how best we can then deal with the other elements that perhaps are the opportunity costs of that no-no. It's much more about conscious thinking. It might be an abstract answer, but I've got no other way of describing it. Regarding lessons to learn from energy, it is, I think, I've got no particular example, but I think the principles are the same. If you look at what have been the change drivers in the energy sector, you find that the change drivers can also be financial. I believe that finance is the enabler of everything good and bad, and even the ugly. It enables that. So if you deal with the financing, like they have dealt with the financing in energy, energy, and maybe financing coal as an example, and make punitive financing arrangements for for that kind of environmentally damaging alternative, very punitive, and even go to the source of the financing, it might be that you may be able actually to get to the nerve center of the things that drive bad practices and be able to control it at that point. But I take the point that we need to learn from what is it that is driving energy changes, and what is it that can be learned more broadly, and what is it that can be customized again to the country's situation. What is at the end of the day is much more contextual. Again, a bit of a fluffy abstract answer, but that's the best shot that I could give over.
Okay, thank you very much. I have another question from Andrew Cochran, who's head of agriculture, Illovo Sugar Africa. And this is what he says. There is an ongoing debate around increasing food production versus food distribution. How can we go about addressing this seeming contradiction when we still have undernourished and food insecure people in Africa? If we can increase food production from less land area, surely we can then restore habitats from areas in excess of food production requirements. So there might be a need for governments to incentivize this, such as subsidies that are given to farmers in Europe to not cultivate. So subsidy to stop cultivating. That's a bit tricky, isn't it?
I can start with that.
Okay.
Moderate. Because it's an issue at the core of my heart. So thank you so much, Andrew, for asking that question. And in fact, you're absolutely right that currently the total food that we produce in the world is much more than, it is more than able to feed the current population. And if we look at projected growth in terms of population in Africa alone, you know, we're expecting to grow by double the current population size. But the question is, and this is a very, very difficult one. I am working in the space of research. I'm working in the space of working with farmers and implementation groups. And the question is, should we be pushing for increasing productivity all the time? Should we be asking whether we produce enough food to be able to feed the population? Either the question is not an aspect of enough food being produced, but an aspect of access. This access, the challenges in access are global. So you see areas, you know, I'm going to be a bit blunt here. You know, areas that are producing a lot of food, then it's dumped on the African continent, either through these kind of subsidy programs or government-to-government arrangements, or even through food aid in areas where you have shortage, right? And this hypothesis was put back a long time ago by Amartya Sen, who talked about food availability decline and showed that even in the Bengal famine and the Ethiopian famine in the 1970s and 1990s, people were not starving and dying in those famines because there was not sufficient food in the world. It's because those people lacked access to that food. And so I really like this question, not because I have an answer to it, but because we do need to ask ourselves, should we be pushing for increasing productivity left, right, and center, even at the expense, even when we know very well, we do want to limit expansion into natural ecosystems, that there is a limit to it, even if you intensify and use all sorts of inputs, and there's a limit to which that natural ecosystem, that piece of land can be able to produce food. So shouldn't we be reimagining our global food systems, global trade arrangements, regional food systems, country food systems, to ensure that access is as a big priority as for production? I've not had that big debate in the food systems discussion, and I think it's critical that you raise it, and we need to continue raising it. Elizabeth, allow me to point out that even in a country like mine, Kenya now, you have regions in the northern part, currently there's starvation. We are talking about people starving. And there are some regions within the country where farmers are having maize that is going to waste. So it's not just a global one, it's also at the country level, this kind of access mechanisms and ensuring that we have social equity and justice in our food system is going to be critical. So sorry to hijack the question, and Andrew, it's critical. I don't think that there's a clear answer to it, but it is a question that does need to be amplified, and for us to think on strategies to amplify access as much as we are amplifying productivity.
Can I just come in just briefly? I mean, this for me is a classic example of why it has to be the entire system. The moment you look at productivity and you don't look at the entire system, then you run into these kinds of problems. I think a system's way of looking at from pre-production to production to the consumer and everything in between will help the alignment that we need to balance the equation much better than to look at productivity in isolation with many other aspects of it.
Thank you very much. Nachilala.
Yeah, I think it's a relevant question. I would agree with Ishmael. I think starting from the point where Susan is saying there's food that's being produced now. It's not reaching people who need it. For me, it speaks to the need for the food community to look at the support sectors as well, at least for what is being produced. How do we make sure the food loss and food waste goes to zero? How do we set a goal to get to zero for that? It requires investments in storage infrastructure of all different sorts. It requires improvement in logistics and transport. Okay, so which is why at the beginning of my presentation, I did say that when we're looking at the food system, it's not just the production side, it's all these other related elements. So for example, if you look at the education system, what role are education systems playing in moving us towards nature positive production, production that reduces emission, that is conservative in terms of utilization of lands and other resources. So I would say that we need to look at the whole system. There's production that's going on, and maybe we shouldn't, I would agree with Susan actually, we shouldn't worry too much about the levels of productivity as much as strengthening the system to reduce and eliminate food waste, but at the same time, for farmers who make their minimum living from production needs to be incentivized through different ways. There could be part of social protection programs. There could be different ways in which they get a reward for not extensifying, for producing organically in a way that's friendly to the environment. So some market-based approaches around that, really making agroecology cool and attractive and rewarding financially as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nachila. All your answers are so relevant and they are so dear to my heart, living in a very rich country where we still have nearly 1 million of people malnourished, which is really, so these are universal problems. So if you find a solution, please tell us. So there is another question, which is quite close to the other one, but on a different perspective. So it's from Lumbesi Limweta, is an environmental engineer from Zambia. So his question is, how do we make sure that the local farmers in rural areas benefit from this transition to sustainable food systems and land use? Because only when they see the direct economic benefit and social benefit of these practices, then they will adopt them. So how can we have them on board?
So thank you for that question from my country person. So WWF has been implementing a conservation agriculture where we started with 2,000 farmers. Now we have about 7,000 farmers. And basically we've been promoting, limited extensification in the range of conservation agriculture approaches. I think that the number would not have reached from 2,000 to 7,000 if the results and the impact were not seen from the point of view of food security, from the point of view of income. Where, again, from a systems point of view, we need to do better is to make sure that those who are producing sustainably are supported with market linkages, with markets that will give them a fair price for the effort and support. So we should not look for these sort of incentives and solutions only from government. Government can start something, but we need to make it bankable, marketable enough for the system itself to reward those farmers that are actually producing sustainably, using the waters efficiently, managing their soils and doing all, limiting the utilization of fertilizer. And perhaps we as agents, we need to do more in terms of profiling success stories, because those are the ones that help to change the culture and also help to change the perceptions. Thank you.
Can I just add, Elizabeth,
yeah, of course,
just
Ishmael.
one line on this? I think fundamentally, this is one of the areas that the food systems sort of summit was looking at. There was actually an area of equitable livelihoods. For me, coming from the farmer side, it's really an issue of equity and fairness in the distribution of value and risk along the chain. If you don't address that, no matter how green you can produce, the farmer is always going to end up getting peanuts out of that. So if we don't deal with the power balance among the players in the value chain, a green value chain or otherwise, we are not going to go anywhere. So we need configurations that are based on the principles of equity and fairness in how we work with each other. So that there is much more money that could be clawed back to the production side without necessarily increasing your effort, but just by rebalancing the distribution of the returns that are in the chain. It's not fair that you have the highest risk and you have the lowest return, and the one with the lowest risk ends up with the highest return, regardless of whether the value chain is green or not. So it is a principal matter that we need to address, and the Food System Summit was actually dealing with that. Over.
And what was the solution in Ishmael? Because you are responding to a fundamental issue. Just to give an example about this, a similar challenge we had in another sector. We were talking yesterday about how we introduce green bonds in Zambia, but there's a bigger problem about the bigger capital markets. Why aren't they deepening? So the supply chains are not working well for smallholder farmers, the ones that are producing organically and inorganically. And I think there's a need for effort that needs to go to look at how these broken points can be, how players can come in to sort of bridge the gap, how government can facilitate that. But I strongly believe in the long run, the system should be self-running, self-regulating, and perhaps the markets should reward, because when demand and supply know each other, things do happen. When they meet, things do actually happen. So it's about holding the hands of the farmers so that they get a level of stability, production, and quality that will make their off-taker, for lack of a better term, feel comfortable that they have solid partners. Thank you.
Susan, would you like to add one word? Because I see the time is running out. So do you have something to add to this last question and conversation?
Yeah, I know I described the power of the business case, but I also want to acknowledge the failure of the markets. And that's why we have government policies, we have coming in between the markets. So I'd like to differ a little bit and say, I don't think that just leaving it to the powers of demand and supply can address the aspects that Ishmael has raised along the value chain. That's where policies come in. We need to think about perhaps minimum guarantee for returns of farmers on some of these commodities that are being produced sustainably. And last but not least, I'd also like to emphasize on what we've seen on the African continent on the adoption and disadoption of technologies. So farmers, if a project is there, they take it up, and once the project goes, we've seen a lot of research that is showing a lot of adoption and disadoption. So to make it sustainable, it has to be co-designed with the farmers, with these kind of safeguards being put in place. So co-designing with the farmers, understanding what are the challenges, and putting in enough guardrails to ensure that along the way, farmers are benefiting from production, from the markets. These farmers have to be at the center of it. So I think that's how I'd like to just sum it up.
Susan, oh, yeah. And thank you very much, Ismail and Nachilala. And thank you for all the questions. We have not been able to answer all the questions. They're in the chat, so they can be answered later on by interacting with the speakers. And thank you very much for the question, the audience. I will not be able to wrap up everything we said because it's too rich. I would just say that there is a strong case for changing our food system. And and this has been said by all of you, we need knowledge, we need to share experience, our knowledge, and this is what we do in the MAMO panel, is really this notion of peer system. So thank you very much. I hand it over to Mira so that she can close by telling us which are our next meeting in the MAMO panel sessions. Thank you very much. Mira, I hand it over to you before we close.
Thank you. Thanks, Elizabeth. And what a fascinating discussion. I really enjoyed that. Thank you, everybody, for joining. I will not add a lot, just to say that we have a Malabar-Montpellier forum coming up on the 23rd of November. More information about that will be available on our website and through our newsletters in due course. So please stay in touch, please sign up for newsletters, and we look forward to continuing discussions through all the various different social media outlets. Have a lovely evening and day.
Thank you.